we're a small company with a really big objective and idea, and we're taking a different approach to protecting your businesses and your agencies' data. And of course, I think it's been in the presentations that I've been watching now, and based on the questions that I've heard, we're all aware of the security issues and challenges that we're all facing today, regardless of you're an individual or a large government agency. But we're continued to be plagued by common attacks like ransomware, very diabolical and ingenious attackers from inside and outside of the businesses. So these could be people on the inside that we're trying to protect ourselves against, and that can be an extremely challenging thing to do, given the fact that they have access to physical on-premise devices and facilities. And so at Cigent, we're trying to take a different approach to trying to protect what it is that they're after. And if you think about really what they're after, what are all of these attacks for? They're after the data, right? They're after it to either take it away from you, make it unavailable to you, so that you pay to get it back, or to use it against you in some sort of blackmail or form of ransoming your information to get it back. And so Cigent has taken a different approach based on the history of many of the founders in defending data, and we're doing it in a different way that you've probably never seen before. What we're trying to do is bring the best practices of cybersecurity down to the file level. So what this means is that instead of trying to protect an entire fence around an organization, one of the best practices in cybersecurity today is to allow you to defend a protect surface, which is usually much smaller. If you think about your what's valuable to you as a person or as an organization, the data is usually in a well-confined, well-defined location. It may be on your laptop, it may be on a server, but your files are in a particular set of locations. In addition to that, there's this notion of a layered defenses, and this is a very common practice today, where you're kind of putting, increasing layers of defense around what it is you're trying to protect. But we're doing it starting at a level that's really unique, in that we're down into the firmware of the storage devices, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. In addition, we bring to this interface the ability to second factor authenticate to get access to specific files. So this is something very unique as well, and I'll kind of show it to you in a slide to make you understand what that means. But it's very simple but very effective. And it's also posture aware type of protection. Many of the protections that are out there today in the form of full disk encryption or many others are not posture aware. It means they don't know if the system is, or your environment is, under attack currently. So if there's a phishing attack going on, if your machine has detected a virus or a malware that's potentially unwanted application on your machine, during that period of time, the posture can be raised on the machine and increase the level of authentication required to access these particular files. This really all comes from a very common framework that is becoming widely adopted today called zero trust, which means that rather than having a assumption of trusting everybody, we're having an assumption of no trust, and that you need to prove and identify who you are in order to access these sensitive sets of information. So Cigent provides a number of, or two different types of the solutions that work together. It provides a hardware solution, which in the form of a solid state device, which is M.2 NVMe, if you're familiar with storage devices, that these exist in most contemporary laptops and servers today. Very fast, no more spinning media. But what's different here is that in addition to the standard firmware that's available on a security-oriented one of these called self-encrypting drives, we have a custom additional firmware code on here that'll provide some additional layers of security and enhancements that I'll talk about in just a second. In addition to that, there's software in the form of an agent and central management console that work in concert with this built-in security on the endpoint devices to provide really that layered and holistic approach that I mentioned earlier. So once you have this solution in place, the user is almost unaware that these protections are in place, except for one difference. When you go to access a file by clicking on it in Explorer, say, when these files are under protection by our solutions, the user is challenged with a second form of a request for authentication in the form of a number of different mechanisms. Biometric is one of the supported mechanisms, like fingerprint, if you have a fingerprint reader on your laptop, or if you're on this webinar with an IR or a Windows Hello compatible camera, it can be used that, it can be a PIN, it can be an authenticator application, or even something as sophisticated as Cisco Duo. But regardless, the user is asked to authenticate. Put your finger on the fingerprint reader and the file opens. It's no more complicated than that. Once all of those solutions are that I mentioned, the hardware and software are in place, that simple act of second factor of authentication stops these common attacks in their tracks, right? So even if the user were accidentally to click on a link and download malware, as soon as that malware goes and attempts to encrypt or exfiltrate that data from that device, it's a challenge comes up, and as long as the user doesn't authenticate that, those can proceed no farther. Even if an insider had the credentials and could sit down here at my laptop, they still could not access these files because they don't have my biometric or PIN or secret information to get to those files. So it's a very simple but very effective mechanism. Now, really, the secret sauce in this, and where the lineage of the company comes from in the data recovery and forensics space, working for some very secure agencies, we'll say, what we've done is we've taken some of that knowledge and we've built it into the drives. First off, you can define what are called secure drives, which are cryptographic locations on these drives that are not only your standard hardware encrypted, but also locked by a technology that's been around for a long time but not very much used, called TCG Opal. So from a table stakes perspective, you have this ability to define these locations that simply show up as drives in your on your device, right? Like another drive, just like if you were to plug in a USB drive, exactly the same thing. Now, in addition to that, there's some very key capabilities, and these have been much demanded and requested by customers. I'll talk about in a second. I'm going to start from the bottom up in the blue. True erase is a capability that gives you the ability to actually verify that the entire drive and all the blocks on that drive had in fact been erased. So it can be used as a last step in your secure data destruction procedures that you might already have today, because with the advent of SSDs, a lot of the mechanisms that were used to erase and verify erasure of magnetic media that we all loved in the past doesn't work very well in this new space. And what this true erase technology allows you to do is actually verify that every single bit of information has been erased from these drives, giving you the ability to safely reuse that drive or that device, even if it had previously contained secure or sensitive information. Really increasing your ROI from having to shred that device to ensure its data has been destructed. To also fill an egregious gap in many solutions that are out there today, Keep Alive, what it does is it starts a non-replayable heartbeat between the hardware and the software on the device, such that if the software becomes disabled, the device automatically locks and protects itself. So there's zero way, it's impossible to circumvent the protection by disabling the OS component, which is a huge vulnerability for many existing solutions that are out there today. And finally, the log auditing is essentially every single command that is sent or received from the device is stored in firmware memory, the metadata about that. What that gives us the ability to do is working in conjunction with the software that's on there, the device can tell if attempts were made to read or write information from that device without the authenticated application doing on the machine. So in other words, if you walked up or someone walked up and took my external drive while I was out at lunch and tried to read data from it and then put it back where it was, the software can detect that unauthenticated, unauthorized access had actually occurred during that time, and you can report on it. Not only can you see when it happened, but the information is stored such that it can tell you if any files, what files were essentially impacted or could have been impacted by that. Now, of course, if they were stored in these cryptographic partitions, there's no way they could access that. But since these are standard SSDs, you can also store unprotected locations on there, maybe for sharing purposes and such. But even if the entire drive was cryptographically locked and someone was trying to access the drive, they could, of course, not get to the files, but you can detect that unauthorized activity. Coming shortly or in the next quarter or so, we're going to build on that and actually build in machine learning-based ransomware detection using that same information right into the device. So what this device will do is essentially become a self-defending SSD from ransomware. Okay, so that's an extremely powerful and unique offering in the industry. So these devices will now protect themselves from ransomware by simply activating those cryptographic partitions and locking your data away when your device comes under attack. And finally, dual mode is also, I'll talk about it a little bit more in our customer's example, but dual mode gives you the ability to kind of have an A and B side of a record, so that the data that's stored on one side can only be active or can only be seen by the and flipped to the other side by an authorized person. So in cases where you have a secure travel program where you want to make sure that if that device were to fall into bad actors' hands or be stolen, that information is completely invisible whilst it's on one side versus the other. So maybe once you go through a travel security location and that you get your laptop back, you can flip to the other side. I'm just going to finish up here pretty quickly, but once you've probably gone, well, that's really interesting and that's really sounds great. I have some solutions I thought were helping me or covering me with many of these security needs today, but I just want to touch on a couple of them. A full disk encryption is a very important component, but it only protects data while it's at rest. As you saw with the fingerprint authentication that I kind of demoed in a slide, once you unlock your full disk encryption, it's vulnerable to the same malware that any non-self or full disk encrypted data is. Backing up your data to a OneDrive, Dropbox, or S3 bucket is a good way to make sure you don't lose the data, but it doesn't protect the data from being stolen and used against you, which is another common attack today. And of course, next-gen AV and EDR solutions, Windows Defender, all these that are out there today are important, but they don't really protect from compromised credentials and an insider. Again, if a trusted person comes into my office while I'm not here and accesses my laptop, it doesn't prevent them from doing that because they have basically physical access and are pre-trusted. So this solution becomes part of one of these an overall layered solution that you should have in your environment today per that zero trust framework. Quickly, just going through, we have a lot of customers ranging from DoD to the intelligence community and military. I kind of touched on many of these functionalities before, and that's really where many of the requests came from. But customers like in the DoD customer is interested in ensuring that data has been erased, right? It's a big problem that when devices get turned over, instead of destroying them, they can ensure that the data has actually been erased and safely reuse them, really increasing, saving a lot of money because these SSDs are quite expensive. I mentioned that intelligence community customer is interested in that kind of dual mode where you can have an A and a B side, such that in most cases you're on one side of the drive where there's no secure information and there's no idea that there's additional storage there in that device. And once you're in a secure location, you can then flip to the other side of that device and get access to that secure location. And of course, we're working closely also with the U.S. Air Force, trying to protect data that resides on aircraft and ground-based systems as well. So that hopefully gives you an idea of what it is that we do and enticed you to want to learn more about that. If you do, please reach out again to our valued partner and reseller, NNet Services.